welcome to the next set of lectures for CSC324 web programming. So today what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to write code that allows the book voter sort of reference application that we're building to work with an actual framework, an actual web framework in Python called Flask. So the way we've been progressing so far is we built a web application using BookVoter, using really basic tools, and got it to work. And then I asked you to write your own email application using the same basic tools. And I think for all of you that this was a bit of a struggle, but you got through it, you got it working. Awesome. Then I said, hey, there's a better way. Why don't we try to come up with a way of organizing all of the code into different pieces? So I introduced this thing called the model view controller architecture or design pattern. And we use some tools to organize our code around that model view controller design pattern. And then I talked about the data access object design pattern as well. And we organized our code around the data access object design pattern. And we put all that together and we got BookVoter to work. And then right now you're going off and you're re-implementing your email program using that homegrown web framework. Flask, what we're going to talk about today, Flask is an actual framework in Python for building web programs. So it provides a lot of really nice tools and technologies that make it much easier to write programs for the web. Now, you might be wondering after I show you how to use Flask, why the heck didn't you show me how to use this in the first place? Well, I think that any sufficiently advanced technology, to quote a very famous science fiction author, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I didn't want you to think that all of this web programming and the way it worked was magic. So we started with really basic tools. You know how the underlying ideas of how web programs work function. And now I'm introducing a really nice framework that's going to make it just much more easier for you to build web applications. So I suspect in the future that as you grow as a programmer and you end up in possibly in some project where you want to write a web program, that you'll use a framework like Flask, or there's dozens and dozens of frameworks for Python, and every other language on the planet that's got some web application building ability has frameworks that you can use. So all right, let's get going. So we're going to start by creating an application called BookVoter. Now, this is very different from what we've been doing in the past, where we've had basically one Python file for each web page that we want to display. When we're writing a Flask-based web application, we're going to have just one central program, and we're going to call it BookVoter. And then from that central program, we'll have methods that serve each of the web pages that we're building. These methods that we're writing in BookVoter will be the controller methods for each of the web pages that we want to display. All right. Now, there are about, maybe 15 or 20 from statements that will go to on the top of this code. And I don't want you to type all of those in. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say a whole bunch of lots of from statements. Okay, so if you go to the course website, let's take a look. So if you go to the course website and you scroll down here to the Python-based web server application, I'll zoom in a little bit here, and oops, let's get back down to the Python-based web application. All right, and you go to the BookVoter Flask framework. There's a link here. All right, if you click on that download link, you can download the entirety of the program that we're writing. What I want you to do is take notes based on what I'm writing right now. That would be my advice. If you don't want to take notes, I guess you can just watch it, but it's kind of boring if you're just watching. I think it's better if you take notes. Or you can just type along with me, whatever you want. But the actual code that I'm writing is going to be located in that link. So you can download that and then use that to help build the next use that as kind of a starting point to help build the next email application that you want to build. Okay, so assuming that lots of from statements have already been declared, then what we're going to do is write a line here, app equals Flask underscore name underscore. So this basically creates an app structure in Flask that's based on the name of the program. So book voter. All right, so that's the name of our Flask program. Now, this app is a global variable, and it's very useful in Flask applications. So we're going to create an @app.root. So this basically says in Flask, if someone says login, that's what I just did. If someone says login, and they are either doing a post or a get, then I want the next method to get executed. So we're going to call this the login method. The code that appears here in the login method is the controller for the web application, for the login page. So remember, with model view controller, we have a model, we have a view, we have a controller. So the view is going to be the HTML that gets spit back to the user that's rendered in the browser. The controller is the thing that acts as an interface between the view and the view's manipulation of the model. And then the model is our data and data store that we're managing using the data access object or DAO design pattern. All right. So here we are in the login controller. So what do we want to do? Well, first of all, I want to set up a pattern here of I want to have an error local variable. And I'm going to set that to none because I'm going to assume that I don't have any errors right now. Now, like every other example of book footer that we've done in the past, we need to figure out if we're at login here for the first time or it's because the user has done some kind of post. So for the first time, to check that, what we're going to do is we're going to use an if statement, and we're going to say if user ID is in request.form. So Flask has a way of interrogating forms that have been submitted, and the way you can interrogate forms that have been submitted is using a data structure called request.form. Now, what I've just said in this if statement, it basically says, look at request.form, which is a list, and see if, or actually I think it's a dictionary, and see if user ID is in that dictionary. And it may be, or it may not be. If it's not in request.form, what it means is this is probably the first time the user has viewed the page and viewed the login page, and we don't have a form submission yet, so we don't have a user ID to work with. If there is a user ID value in request.form, well, that means that the user typed in the user ID, probably typed in a password, and then clicked submit, and we're back in login because there was a form submission. So if the user ID is in request.form, then we're going to make sure the user ID is valid. So this should look familiar too, is valid, and we're going to pass in request.form user ID, request.form password. So this is how we're extracting the user ID and password from the form. And if that is valid, then what we're going to do is we're going to return survey. So that's kind of cool. So that basically says if we have a valid user ID and password, we want to return the survey page. All right. And we'll talk about how that return survey works in a second once we get to the survey code. All right. If user ID is not, back up here. So if user ID is, oops, no, I set that up right. Else, if user ID was in request.form, but it wasn't valid, it means it didn't exist in the database or the password wasn't correct, then we're going to set something called an error variable. This is just a local variable called error, but we can use it if we want to someplace else. Invalid user ID password, that's our error. Okay. Now, the last thing we're going to have in this method is return render template login.html ** locals. Okay. And that is it. So let's talk a little bit about what just happened here. So basically, this is it for the login controller. So hopefully you're saying, oh my gosh, this is awesome. I don't have to write a lot of code to get login to work. And that's true. There's some complications here that we're going to have to work out. But what's so great about Flask is it really reduces the amount of code that you have to write to get the whole web application running, and it lets you concentrate on doing cool and interesting things with your web application. So if the user ID is in request form, if it is, make sure the user ID is valid. If it is, then return the survey page. Otherwise, set an error. Okay, so if the user ID is not in request form or it's not valid, then we're going to return the login page. And the login page is actually an HTML page, which we'll take a look at in just a second. And we're going to pass in a special data structure called locals. Locals is actually a funky way of getting any local variable that's been defined in the method, the Python method login, any local variable that's been defined in login can get passed into the web page login.html, and we can access and manipulate it using a slightly weird language that's a little bit like Python. All right, so I'm hoping this all makes sense. So what I want to do next is I want to explore login.html, so we can just take a look at what that HTML page looks like. And then I want to explore is valid. All right. So let's take a look at login.html. So login.html is going to be displayed if the user ID wasn't in the form or it was an error. So it won't be in the form when this is the first time, when we haven't done a form submission. So this is the first time we're trying to view the login page. And we also want to display the login page if we have an error, if the user ID or password was invalid. Okay, so let's take a look at we're going to take a look at the login.html page. So this should look really familiar. Let's take a look at this. This looks like just regular HTML, right? There's my doc type, there's my head. Here's all the code that makes login work. The one thing that's kind of interesting here is that there's no action. It doesn't say go to a particular py file. So the action is going to default to when you click the form submit, going back to the base URL of the web page. And that's important because of the way that the code for URLs gets executed on the back end in Flask. And that will be obvious in a moment when we actually run some code. So basically, this is just pure HTML, except for this one little weird piece of stuff here, and that's this URL for static, file name equals index.css. So this is a special piece of code that you have to put in to get the href to work for your style sheet. The directories, let me get out of here for a second. So the directories, let's see, how do I want to do this? Let's go back to book footer. The directories that hold the HTML and the CSS will be pretty obvious as well. I'll show you those in just a second. Let's see. I'll just tell you. So the directory that holds the HTML should be the templates directory. So the directory should be called template, has to be called templates. And then the directory that holds your CSS is going to be called static. So there's my static directory and there's my CSS. Okay. So book footer is going to run under the book footer Flask directory. So that's just the arbitrary directory that I said book footer .py should run in. And then I'm going to have a templates directory that's running, that's got login.html in it. And then I'm going to have a static directory that's going to have index.cs, my index.css. And then I'm going to go back to my templates directory just to remind you one more time that there's only one funky line of code right now, and that's this line here, this href that says URL for static file name equals index.css. So this weird code extracts some important information that gets placed by Flask when that href line gets interpreted. All right, so let's go back to the code we were just writing. Okay. So let me explain what happens then when this render template method gets executed. It's kind of cool. So when render template gets executed, it goes and finds the file login.html in the templates directory, and it basically goes through each line of login.html and looks for those weird curly brackets that I showed you that were on the link for the CSS page. It looks for these special weird curly brackets. If it finds those, it does some special substitution. But other than that, it leaves the rest of the HTML alone. And then it squirts all that HTML back to the browser. So that's really cool. So if you think about what we were doing before, we had a special method called login view that was associated with the login controller. And the login view did a series of Python print statements to send HTML back to the browser. We're not doing that anymore. We're writing almost pure HTML. We're saving that in a special file, and this render template is going to find that pure HTML, sucking it in, doing some processing in case we want to do some special substitutions that are kind of cool, and then squirting that HTML back to the browser for us automatically. How awesome is that? That's really awesome. Okay, so let's do one more bit of code, and that's to get if is valid working. All right, so is valid is this method here that checks to make sure that the user ID and password from the form are correct if we actually have a form submission. So let's write the code for that. Oh, one more thing before I do that. So there's a couple things here. I want to talk about @approot. So @approot basically says if the user types the IP address of the machine, the proper port number, :/login, execute the code in the login method. All right, so that's how the URL that's typed in a browser gets linked to this login method. And I'll show you how to execute book voter in a moment. Okay, so let's do def is valid, user ID, password. And this is valid method looks really similar to the one that we had for our own homegrown framework. We're going to create a DAO. And then we're going to do a DAO select by user ID. And then I'm going to say if user is not none and user ID equals user.user ID and password equals user.password, then we're going to do the following. We're going to say session user equals encode user. So this does something really cool. What it does is it actually takes the user, if it finds the user in the database, in the data store, and the user ID and password match for what was entered by the user in the form, then it encodes the user into a special object that is then stuffed in something called the session. And we're giving the name of the thing in the session, we're calling it the user session object. Now, the user session object is a special piece of state information that hangs around in your Flask web application for the duration of the web application's execution. So that's really cool. So it's something that hangs around, and every time you go back to your web application, you can ask, what is the value of user? And on any web page, in any method that's running in your web application. So later in survey, when we get to survey, after the survey page is displayed, we can say, hey, session, what's the value of user? And we'll be able to get the user that was stored when the login happened. So that'll be super useful. All right, and then what we're going to do is we're going to return true, indicating that we were able to get a valid user, else we're going to return false. And that is it for the login page. So that is valid working. You have to spend some time talking about the data access object pattern for user, because I've changed it slightly to make it even simpler to work with. But for right now, this is good enough information for us to do a demo program do a demo run of this small Flask program and just observe how it operates. Okay, so now that we've got this login route working, how do we actually run the program so that we can log into the system? So I want to show you how to do that. We'll save that. That's our sort of working book voter. I'll go to where the actual code is for book voter Flask, and you can download this from the website, as I've mentioned. And the way you get this to work is, instead of doing that Python thing that runs the HB server, you're going to run a Flask-aware server. So we're going to say Python 3 book voter, and you're actually going to run the code that we just wrote. Okay, so now we're running the book voter program, and if we go to the website, so for me it's this IP address :8000, and we say /login, no login.py, we just say /login, then boom, the login page appears. Now, let's take a look at why that appeared. Like, why isn't it executing login.py, right? I'm not specifying login.py. How does it know that bookvoter.py is where it's supposed to go to pick up all this stuff? Well, the answer to that is let's take a look at bookvoter.py. The answer to that is in this root. This @app root right here says that when the user goes to the machine and port specified where Flask is running, and if the user says /login, then execute the code in this login method, right? And just to review, what it'll do is say, hey, is there a user ID in the form that's been submitted? The answer is no, if it's the first time we're viewing it. Okay, we'll render the login.html page, which we've already looked at. All right, now if I go to fill this in and I say Bob CS Rocks 55 and click submit. Oops, it's not going to work because I've got it. Let me get over here. Okay. I get this vote for a book. So now this code that you're looking at here is the code that the survey route handles. So that's really awesome. Okay. So now let's go back here and look at the code again. So if I fill in a user ID, we check to make sure it's valid. And if it's valid, we return the survey page. Otherwise, we set up an error. So that's all that happens in the login method. Now remember, this login method is the login controller, but we also have a survey controller and we have a results controller as well. And we're going to write the code for that shortly.